Welcome to the American Small Business League podcast. I am Bruce Tatoris, and with me is Jenn Brothers, running for Congress as an independent in Pennsylvania District 9. Her website is jennbrothersforcongress.com. Jenn grew up in the Rust Belt and coal country and chose Pennsylvania as her home. She's a mother who's been a proud member of labor unions in a diverse career in private investigation, correctional law enforcement, higher education administration, banking, and entrepreneurship. Jenn has a practical understanding of how policies affect families, small businesses, and communities, and how systems can be improved to work better for everyone.
Well, here's the thing. I'm here to fight for the general public. And you can't fight for the general public without fighting for our communities. And what's the center of every community? It's small businesses. So I'm out here fighting for every small business owner to make sure that they have the ability and the access to these contracts that really make or break a lot of us. As a former small business owner, I owned a company and we applied for government contracts on a case by case business or case by case basis. And more times than not, you get declined. And because there's not that openness about how those contracts work, we need transparency in our government. I hear every single day that, Jenn, we need transparency, we need accountability. And when you're looking at the stats and at the basic requirements, and I know we'll get into this a little bit later, but the basic requirements for the SBA to provide X number of contracts to small businesses, and especially small businesses owned by women, that it's a nominal amount. When 50% of the population, and I know you guys talk about this, when 50% of the population is female, is women, then why are we only giving 5% of our contracts to women? It doesn't make any sense. And why, with the percentage of small businesses in America, why are most of the contracts going to these big entities, these multinational corporations, when in America we need to make sure that we pull things back and we go back to that central ideal of community and holding people accountable? The SBA doesn't really do that. They're reactive, they're not proactive. And we need to make sure that we're looking at a proactive government. And that brings in my background, right? So I was in banking, I was in higher education, I worked in law enforcement, and I worked in the private investigative field. And that's not reactive, that is holding systems and people accountable in most of those instances. Most of those jobs that I've had have had that accountability factor. How are we making sure that we are meeting what we are minimally required to do? And how are we going above and beyond for our communities? And that's what I am as a candidate. I'm trying to go above and beyond for my community, to fight for the small businesses, talk to our business owners, and say, what do you need to acquire a larger percentage of government contracts? And pushing the entities in charge of that, like the SBA, which is what you and Lloyd do all the time. You push the SBA.
I am blown away by your graciousness and your intelligence to argue our position and points out of the gate in a brand new conversation. You just impressed me as, a consummate representative, because when you know, and you must already know, the issues of your district, as well as the issues of the American Small Business League, you
Mhm.
just demonstrated to me beyond the shadow of a doubt. I'm having trouble even finding the words to say this, to say all that succinctly. So
Listen, Bruce, I know the job that I'm applying to do. I'm applying to be a public servant. So I can't serve the public if I don't know the needs of the public. And I'm going to do my research.
you're spot on by emphasizing small business, because many people don't know that we are nothing but a small business nation. 99.9% of all businesses in America are small businesses. And there is this thing that most people don't know about, that 23% of all federal contract dollars are supposed to go to small businesses, and we've been exposing for decades how they don't. They are not going where they're supposed to, even though the SBA says every year that they are. And the bottom line is it's costing us hundreds of thousands, maybe up to 2 million extra new jobs every year being created that would boom the economy because the big businesses that get small business contracts are already big. They don't create new jobs to do that work. But real small businesses would create new jobs. And if you're a small business and you're thinking, Bruce, I don't care, I'm never going to apply for a federal contract. I cut hair, I fix garage doors. Wait a minute. When the businesses in your community get those contracts that they can apply for and win and hire the people to do those work, they do that work. They're going to need haircuts. They're going to need their garage doors fixed. It'll boom the whole economy.
When we spend locally, if we spend $40 locally, that really turns into what, $120? Because I spend next door with my neighbor who mows the yard, and then he goes and he spends money at the local repair shop for that mowing business that he has. And that money gets spent locally, and that's why back in the day, back in the 90s,
Yeah.
we used to have a more community central economy. So we had more local businesses and we had a bigger economy. And I'm going to tell you that that feeds into food insecurity, that feeds into our housing problems that we have right now. It feeds into so many different portions of your life. And you really have to step back and kind of think of, well, overarching, what do I want to see my world look like? And how do we get there? And it all goes back to small businesses. Now, I'd love to fight for healthcare in America, and I am fighting for healthcare in America. It's one of my top issues is making sure that the healthcare system works for the everyday American. In order for us to get there, I would like to go to a more universal type system of healthcare instead of the insurance-based system of healthcare. And then part of it too, campaign finance reform. We start looking at the FEC data. We start looking at where the money comes from and who has decided that they can make decisions for you as the public. And some of that we got to stop, right? So with my campaign, I don't take corporate PAC funds because my focus honestly isn't for them. It is for the American economy and the America that I grew up hearing about, where anybody can own a business, anybody can make America better.
Will you be on the ballot?
For the Democrats and the Republicans, for them to ballot, they need 1,000 signatures, right? That's not too bad. For
Right.
independent candidates, you need 2% of the last election, the number of people that voted in the last election, you need 2% of those votes cast. So it's no longer the 1,000. I'm actually looking at a minimum of a little over 5,400 signatures. But we also face the problem where some of those signatures could get disqualified or challenged. So you have to
Yes.
include a buffer.
Yes.
And so I need 8,000 signatures
By when?
by August 1st. Well, August 1st is when I will collectively put all of the paperwork together and drive it down to Harrisburg.
List for me or describe some things about your experience and your expertise that resonate with that's what I want in a representative.
Every single position I've ever had, you were accountable. I worked in law enforcement investigations. I have worked in higher education, banking. Every single position I've ever had, I've found fraud. As a private investigator, I had federal contracts and I also had private contracts. But my main focus in both was to make sure that people were following the rules. And if they weren't following the rules, then it either became a financial consequence or it became a criminal consequence, or sometimes it became both. We need to have representatives that go back and figure out ways to make the world work a little bit better for the average citizen.
The investigative work experience that you had, was that for a company, for another organization, or was that as an independent?
So I actually held a standalone licensure, right? Like I had licensure that I owned as a person. I also had at one point a business license that was standalone for myself. So I was eighth in the country at one of the largest investigative firms in the country because I was licensed as an investigator in Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania. I'm probably forgetting some. Some states don't even require licensure. It's
Mhm.
wild out here.
No, but those states, I'm sure, guaranteed plenty of fraud to look into. How many
Oh yeah.
years? How many years experience did you have basically doing that?
So as a private investigator or combating fraud, because those are
Both,
wildly different numbers.
all together. That's
So
I call that's your investigative, experience. Basically, how many years?
I'm 38 now, so we're
Hmm,
looking at like
almost 30
20
years.
years.
What are the problems of the major problems, the first major, biggest, worst problems of your district that you want to address?
So just pick the low-hanging fruit of infrastructure. I live in Pennsylvania. There's more potholes than people. And
Mm,
some of the roads that we drive on literally are dirt roads or they look like creek beds. And it's just unacceptable in America. You touched on infrastructure. We need infrastructure funding. I'm hearing a lot of healthcare issues, having access to reliable healthcare. It is insane that we do not in America have a methodology or a functioning system that puts people first. You know, you shouldn't have healthcare entities making medical decisions, but we also need literal facilities here. We live rurally. In rural America, we're not really put first in a lot of the bills and policies because we have a lower population
mm,
or our population density is a little bit different. We need to make sure that we have accessible healthcare institutions for people. That's why we're going towards, or hopefully going towards, that universal system. We're also seeing a housing crisis. It's throughout the country. As an investigator, I had the privilege of going into neighborhoods and people didn't know I was there, right? So I was able to see firsthand the how people lived without them knowing that somebody was watching. So you see food insecurity, you see housing that's out of reach, you see people who are working three or four jobs and they're not able to really move beyond that. They're not able to access that. I don't, do you know what Maslow's triangle or Maslow's hierarchy of needs is?
yes.
So in Maslow's, there's that base level, the food, security, shelter, water. We need to fulfill that. And if your government is not fighting to fulfill that bottom tier,
Hmm.
then we why do we have a government? Why are we paying taxes if we're not focusing and fighting for that bottom tier so people can get to
Yeah.
the self-actualization?
Yeah.
So I feel like is my job is to help push towards getting that bottom tier fulfilled, make sure people have the access in order to build their lives up. It's that's it. That's the platform. Those are the
Well,
things we're fighting for.
who represents the district now? Is the incumbent up for reelection?
So the incumbent, he has been in office for over 6 years. We are in a plus 21 district, so that means 21% of the vote in the last election was what he gained. So he is a Republican. His name is Dan Muser. Dan Muser has been in office for 6 years. Dan Muser actually owns a business called Pride Mobility, or at least his family does. Let's just say he's not fighting for the general public. He has very much lined his own pockets. I would also be running against a Democratic candidate. She has worked in politics for most of her life, and she moved up here from DC to run. And here I am sitting in the middle saying we need to still focus on people.
And for many years, part of the community. Do you live in the district?
Yes, I live in the district. I bought an 1840s house. It was built at least in the 1840s. I can read the newspaper from 1846, which is pretty fascinating. You get to see real life history when you knock down a wall. And I've been renovating it for several years at this point. There's always something. But I was pretty ingrained in my community. I actually live in a part of the country, and it took a while because I grew up in Rust Belt and coal country, which I grew up between Ohio and Kentucky. And with that, there are a lot of good parts that right here in Pennsylvania, I was able to kind of capture and say, oh, this is all the good parts of what I remember as a child. We have small communities, we have neighbors that leave. I can't get over it. My first week living here in this house, I had a small table on my front porch, and I woke up and I went out and I noticed that someone had left a basket of fruit. And I was like, who does this? and and
Beautiful.
I
Yeah.
mean, I live in a beautiful, safe area. A lot of people, I probably shouldn't say this on the internet, but a lot of people don't lock their doors. You just go to your neighbor. I mean, we have potlucks, community potlucks, and all of that. So coming into a community like this really makes me angry that someone has been in office for 6 years. You never see him. And he's not part of the community. He doesn't show up to the potluck. He doesn't show up to the cookout. He just has taken from our area. You get campaign donations. There are multiple ways. There's multiple ways how people interact politically, right? Like you have your base tier of people who they just vote, and they vote either once a year or twice a year. If that, sometimes people just vote in the presidential election. Sometimes people vote in the
Hmm.
presidential and then the midterms, like we're getting ready to go through. And then you have
Hmm.
people that vote every single year, every single election.
Hmm.
And that's amazing. So that's your voter block. You
Hmm.
also have people who contribute to campaigns financially, and they're able to help fund things. So when I tell you that I've been driving around the district and knocking on doors, I've had campaign donations that have allowed me to do that as a working class candidate because I am weird. I am just a weird candidate in America because I am going to be one of the only 2% of all members that have went into Congress from the American working class, which is amazing that we would be able to take that historic movement. But it is disheartening because when you're looking at the number of people in America and going back to that representativeness that we need in our government, when you start thinking that only 2% of all members of Congress come from the working class, that's crazy. So I would be combating that, but so some people are able to donate to campaigns. And again, I don't take corporate donations, but we do have a spot on our website and people are welcome to donate, even if they don't live in your district. If you're like, hey, we need this in our government, you
Hmm.
can donate from outside of our district. So
Hmm.
that is another kind of facet or a way to interact politically. Then you have your volunteers. And because of modern technology, it's actually really easier than what most people even think to volunteer on a campaign anymore. I mean, for my specific campaign, we have remote workers. We have people who help with the website, help with social media. They make phone calls and texts. So it's legal to text people as long as you give them the option to not text them. So we
Hmm.
have some volunteers there. I have some volunteers that are disabled or maybe they're younger, because in my district we are able to allow some of the teenagers to come and help, and they get a text list and they just text people and they're like, "Hey, did you know that Jenn Brothers exists and she's pretty cool?" And that's not what the text says. But so we have people that are able to volunteer, and we do have a volunteer sign up on our link tree, which is accessible through our website. And so you can volunteer, you can donate. I'm really fighting for the American public, and I am really fighting for small businesses because I truly believe that's the way that we fix our economy and how we make sure that our neighbors don't have to struggle like we've had to struggle in the past. And if we can push towards having women-owned businesses and having them have a at least proportionate distribution of the governmental contracts, that would make our lives across the country, it would make our lives better because we need to make sure that our contracts are going to people and not these massive corporations because they don't care about you, but your neighbor who does cut hair and does mow the lawns and does maybe they do geographical information science as a subcontractor for one of the major entities. Those are all positions that benefit from having small businesses be the forefront and be more accepted with the SBA. We need to hold people accountable. And we need to hold the SBA accountable. And you and Lloyd do this all the time. And I'm so proud of the work that you all do because really we need to make sure that we are holding these positions accountable. And it goes back to campaign finance too. If people aren't looking, then the FEC doesn't look either. So it's important to have activists like you. Like you're protesting when you do these things, you're a protester. And when you're holding these large government entities accountable to what they say they're going to do, you're actually saying, hey, this is how I want my government to work. And honestly, I'm glad we're friends. I'm glad we met, and I'm glad that you had me on the show because this is really what we're fighting for in America is to make sure that we are bringing it back to small businesses and bringing back community.
I want to make a couple comments about the importance of women-owned small businesses. As you mentioned before, women are half the population, and yet they're supposed to only get 5% of federal contracts. And that might sound like, a handout or something odious, like unfair. No, it's not an entitlement because, and I didn't mention this earlier, I wish I had, women own 40% of all businesses in America, and they
Mhm.
sell what the government buys. The federal government is the largest purchaser of goods and services on the planet. The federal government buys everything under the sun, and women own 40% of all businesses, and they sell what the government buys. But every year of our lives, companies owned by men get over 95% of all federal contract dollars. That has to change. And also, after World War II, which ballooned our government to create an enormous military to fight and win that war, by 1953, Congress passed the Small Business Act, which created the Small Business Administration and charged it with providing access to credit for those businesses that could apply. And also, then it said a fair portion of federal contracts must go to small businesses because as early as then, 1953, it was seen if we don't do something like that, big
Mhm.
businesses are going to capture that entire pie. And it was intended to be the economic stimulus of steering business to small businesses for the sake of that job creation and the maintenance of that part of the American dream, which is to have your own company and be your
Yeah.
own boss, in addition to having your own home and all the other things that we need to remind ourselves was once the American dream of being that kind of independent thing. That's how I want to conclude what I would have to say. And also, thank you so much for being such a great representative of the American Small Business League and looking forward to learning that you've become a great representative of District 9 in Pennsylvania.
I'm
Oh,
so glad you had me today.
so thank you, Jen. And also, I want to thank everybody for watching and listening today.